Bless you. Psalm 103, we're going to talk about the pity of a father. And we're going to read verse 13 here, and then we'll also read one other passage over in the New Testament, kind of give us a little bit of a definition of the word pity, because I think the way we use it today is not exactly how it probably was originally used, of course, and words sometimes just happen to do that probably by accident more than anything. But Psalm 103, verse number 13, notice what it says. It says, like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. Now, if we was to interject, usually the way we use the word pity, we would think to feel sorry for, if someone's in a kind of a real desperate situation. That's not what the word actually means. It doesn't mean to look at somebody and go, just say, boy, that what a pity, we say that. That's again, a word probably accidentally that has come to that. That's not what this means here. Really, only 3 times the word pitieth is used in the entire Bible, twice here in this one verse, and then over in Ezekiel. The word pity is used a little bit. So to help us understand what this means, we'll come back to the sermon here. Notice 1 Peter 3:8, if you want to turn there. 1 Peter 3:8. 1 Peter 3:8. And it says here, finally, be ye all of one mind. So that's kind of the togetherness, unity aspect of things. Having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful. Now, it doesn't mean to walk around looking sad and, just like you're at the bottom of the rung or something. But it does say be pitiful and be courteous. And it goes on to give some other things. But it says it's a command to be pitiful. And when you look within the context here, you see compassion, you see courtesy, and you see love there, and then you see the word pitiful. So as you look at the word pitiful here, Old Testament wise, it means to compassionate or to be compassionate. Greek word for pitiful means to be compassionate or sympathetic. Oftentimes it's also translated tender-hearted, that same word there. So we're going to talk about how the pity of a father and how that's significant. And, of course, going back to this, it says, as a father pitieth his children, the Lord pitieth them that fear him. So we're talking about a compassion element. We're talking about, to use that New Testament, a word translated as that word pity, to be tender-hearted towards. So here's kind of the angle that we're looking at here today. As we talked about this morning, this digging of the wells, and we emphasized the character of fathers, very, very important. Without that, then, of course, passing those traits to a new generation. Sometimes, when you look at the Bible, the things that we have were meant to be passed down. You take someone that had no upbringing, had no father figure, had none of that. God certainly can put you in a place where you can learn that. But here's what often happens, though. What often happens is it's like church here. You take someone that gets saved, has no, we'll say, church background, maybe they was not raised in a Christian home. They come, they start hearing these things. Most of the time they pick up on things by watching people. It's by influence. You can hear these things, but it's kind of like when I remember I was learning to drive. My grandfather, he was a tough fella. Now he had his tender moments too, I guess. But the point is I can remember him saying when I was learning to drive, he had this 51 Ford pickup, and I can remember exactly where it was at. We came right out of the driveway where we lived there. We came to Huff Road. And instead of me stopping, I rolled through that. Now, there's 2 reasons for that. One, first reason is because he had this 51 Ford pickup. I was learning to drive. It was a 3-speed, and I didn't want to change the gears and make that thing, lurch like it does sometimes when you don't know what you're doing. Had a weird clutch to it. It's like it took, like 10 seconds or more for that thing to engage or something. So I didn't want to mess with it. I had it in second gear, and I was just going to roll through it. Second reason, this is the one he called me out on, and he said, why didn't you stop there? And here's what I said. I said, because you never stopped there. And he didn't like that. He said, now do as I say do, don't do like I do. And, of course, what else is he going to say, really? And that's what he did. Oftentimes he would, probably for the same reason perhaps, just didn't want to change it down in the first or whatever. Point is, we can say do as I say do, but, when you look at people, kids pick up on things. They pick up on their fathers. They pick up on their mothers. You let them sit down and watch a television program today, And if you don't know what's going on there, those kids will be saying things, and you'll be going, where'd they get that from? Well, they picked it up somewhere. It just doesn't inherently come like that. I think when it comes to living for God, a lot of it is because you see it, you view it, and you're influenced by it. So this word here to be pitiful. Now, here's where I want to weave this in. This morning we talked about the character aspect, and I think children ought to see their grandparents, their dads, uncles, whoever, school teachers, anybody that's an adult. Kids look and they emulate and they pick up things, and certainly if they don't pick up the character side of things, then there's a good chance they're going to look at that. And here's what often happens. Someone gave the illustration one time, and it makes a lot of sense, that whatever your boundaries are, so in other words, if I hold my hand out here, and if this is my core, this is where mainly I live, this is not my central convictions, but there's some things I would allow in my life, and that being illustrated by the tip of my fingers here. In other words, there's some things you would never do, there's some things you would do, and there's things you would rarely do. Kids, what happens is they sometimes see what you always do, but they'll also pick up on what you might rarely do, and they'll sometimes make that the center of their life. So if adults are not careful when we're talking about young people, they'll look at you and they'll make your sometimes acceptances, they'll make that the center of their life. Now, I think kids need to see character. I think they need to understand that. I don't think most of the time it's not done on purpose. You say, well, I'm going to stop here and I'm going to teach you something. My granddaddy never used those words, I'm going to teach you something. He just lived his life. He did it. I don't even know if he really realized the influence that he had, because a lot of people, they wasn't taught those things. We really get all warm and fuzzy, and you hear all this psychology stuff. He just didn't hear that. His dad was a good man, but none of them were like what you call lovey-dovey. A lot of older folks were not. You look at some of them old photographs, none of them are smiling, or just, like that. I don't think someone said, no, don't smile, because if you smile, that's a sign of whatever. I think, hard times, and it's just, people were happy, but it wasn't like today. It's just like it's almost a little bit like a Hollywood show to even to take a picture. It's almost like you got to make something look different than what it is. But I know this, if you live your life, kids will see that. But I think they also need to see the tender side of people, especially they have a right to show that when they have a strong side. We're talking about being balanced here. We're talking about kids ought to see the convictions. They ought to see the standards. They ought to see all of that. They ought to see that. But they also ought to be, as the Bible says here, to be pitiful, which means to be compassionate. The Lord is holy. He's righteous. He's 100% that. He could easily at any given time say, you have failed, you have failed, you have failed, and we do fail. But God also looks at us, and the Bible even says here, if you look at verse 14, for he knoweth our frame, he remembereth that we are dust. He says, well, I know what they are already. I know how frail they are, and yet God also says there's a standard that you're supposed to live. It's just like your children or anybody. When I'd go to work, they'd say, here's what you're supposed to do. Now, I think a boss inherently already knows that a 16-year-old that's never worked a job in a new environment like I was is going to do some little mess-ups because, well, number one, they're kids. I always say kids are going to be kids. You can't hold a kid to a standard of a 40, 50, 60-year-old person, and yet at the same time, you don't say, well, they're kids, so, nothing really, we'll just wait till they get older, they'll get it. A lot of people have messed up their life getting a pattern of doing some things that's not right. So when I look at this for Father's Day and think about fathers and we emulate the strength of them and the way they live their life, that's wonderful. But also at the same time, I think the proper way for all of us to live is to be that balanced. When you think about God, God is balanced. Look at nature. God has created or has allowed nature to develop the hurricane, the thunderstorm. You look at the powerful winds, you look at the black clouds. If you go to the sea, look at the rolling sea, and look at the strength. You look at lightning and thunder and hear all of that. You look at certain animals that just have a powerful frame about them. The Bible speaks about lions, and it speaks about things like that, the power of a powerful horse. And you see the power aspect, and God shows us a great mighty mountain. You just see power and all like that. And then you also see, if you walk outside, you're going to see a dandelion flower or the rose. Or you're going to hear, like a day like today, just a beautiful soft breeze. God's a very balanced God. God says, I'm a God of holiness. God is angry with the wicked every day, there's no doubt. But God also says, but I am a God of love. And God says, as a father would pitieth his children, as that would be naturally the right thing to do, the Lord pitieth them that fear him. He has compassion. He has care. He's tender-hearted. You know, I think we know some people. Sometimes you characterize people and they get there's one main thing you think about them. And there have been people we've talked about or we've seen or we know, and it's like real strong armed. And yet if you don't know them, there's probably more to them. But I think children, young people ought to see the tender-heartedness of people, especially those that are strong. And I mean that. I think a person has a right to show their tender-heartedness, to show that aspect when they are strong. And I mean that by, like in churches. You got churches, all they want to say is God loves everybody, and he does. There's no doubt about it. God so loved the world that he gave. But they take that and say, but we're not going to preach against sin. We're not going to raise any voice. And in fact, when we raise our children, there's be no corporal punishment. We're not going to do any of that because what they see is we're going to be tender-hearted, and yet what they're missing is you really don't have a right to do that unless you can do the other. You see what I'm saying? In other words, the most balanced person is the person who can look and say, here's exactly what I'm supposed to do, even if it appears hard and stern. But on this side, it makes this even that much more enhanced when you can do this over here. Again, I've known people that, one of the things I think of, my granddad, he broke horses. And he was the kind of guy, he would, if someone had one, nobody could ride it, he'd buck everybody. He wanted it because he really thought that he could make that animal rideable and all of that. And he had a lot in that way. Now, we had some we got on him, and they about half killed us. But he had a knack about him of getting that horse's attention, okay, and the Lord would appreciate this. But I watched him when that horse had gotten where my granddad got his attention, we'll just put it that way. He'd sit there and start petting on that horse and talking real gentle to it, and might give it some little sugar cubes. That horse would be sitting there trembling and sweating because I've seen him just about tear a hitching post down and just about tear up everything around there. And all of a sudden he got their attention, I'll just put it that way, and they'd be sitting there sweating and trembling, and that horse never lost its spirit. I know it's a horse, and I didn't get in this horse's head, but I don't think that horse ever thought, now here's a man that's going to beat me into submission. Didn't do that. I think people that use the Bible sometimes, and the Bible's not the fault here. Here's where taking corporal punishment, and I'm saying this because this does deal with fathers. I think a father should have a respect of his children, and I think because a child should know that a father, if he exercises what God has told him to do, he ought to respect that. He ought to fear that even, because the Bible says if we get out of line, the Heavenly Father, who is love, the one who put Jesus on the cross, he's also the one that says, I will chasten you. And the Bible even speaks about there's a sin unto death. God could have the right to take any of our life if we got to some point where God says, that's it. You're my child, and that's not going to happen. So what I'm saying is this tender-hearted, this pitiful word that God is using here, I think what the world needs to see is strong people who show the strength not only in what we would call the sternness, if you want to please, the holiness aspect, but also be just as committed to the tender-heartedness. And that's what kind of church I like. I like a church that cares for people and loves people, and yet we understand you've got to preach against sin. There has to be these boundaries. And here's just what I wrote down here. First of all, fathers need to be balanced. Going back to this corporal punishment, I always said this, and I'll say it here, even though there's no one raising children, unless someone's going to be having a child soon, and I don't know. And I don't think that's going to happen. But anyway, I'd say this because we had people that were raising their children. And sometimes people have gone to churches, and if they didn't have their mind right, they would take scriptures and they would use them to be abusive. I've never been for abuse. I talk about getting whippings. I never got to the point where I even thought I was abused. I mean, no one wanted a whipping. I may have cried bloody murder, acting like I was about to be killed, but that never happened. That just didn't. If it happened to you, I'm sorry it did. There are situations in which I've heard people, they had a father who was, I'm going to say this in very seriousness here, they had a father that would drink, and then he would tear them children and be in a state of mind that wasn't right. Or do the same thing to a spouse. It's not right. I would never condone that. It's not biblical. And by the way, that's not what makes a man strong. And sometimes Hollywood likes to make these he-men that can go out here and whip up on people. And I get if you're a policeman, soldier, or even if you're in a situation where you got to take care of business, I understand that. But the point is that the strength of a man is not a man who can take his fist and hurt people or whatever. And sometimes the Bible gets the reputation when we talk about this corporal punishment, the literal, spanking, that sort of thing. I always told people, said, look, if you're going to whip those children because you're mad and you're upset, you better back off, because there's nothing about being out of control and training children. There's nothing about that that's right. Just going off and just being angry. There's nothing about that that's right. I'm sure there's been mothers and fathers that have done that. I'm sure they've asked forgiveness. I understand that. And as a rule, that's probably something that wasn't the thing they did all the time. But I'm saying that's not the strength of God. Is not him whipping up on us and making us go, God, I hope you don't kill me today. God does not want that relationship. God says, you're my children, and my children need correction. But correction's not always, the spanking, so to speak. It's train up a child in the way he should go. It's taking the time. My grandfather had no idea what he was doing, but he was training me more than he realized he was training me. And I mean that. And others that I've known like that. But I can remember when you spend time with people, but you also see their balance. You see the tender side of them, where you see them have a part of their heart that's tender, and they look and say, you know what, just like if you look at a child, everybody would have to look at a child and say, you know what, that child does not understand dangers like an adult would anyway. I've seen parents go, don't get in the street, and it looks like they're angry or mad, but the truth is they're afraid their child's going to get killed. Things like that. So I'm saying the Lord pities us because he looks at us, and as verse 14 says, he knows we're but dust in it. He knows that we're prone to be this way, and yet at the same time God says, but if you allow God to train you, you'll get to see the strength of character that you can be. And God says that's the way you're supposed to be. My devotions I do, my theme, I don't really say it, but my theme is found over in the book of Colossians. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. Everything about your life ought to be a conversation, your influence. And again, we don't think of it, but if we live our life like we're supposed to, Lord, let me be an influence to everybody. Let me be a blessing. Let me be a help, but never let me forfeit the salt aspect, which is like the absoluteness of God. It's that strength of God. It's that line that would never be crossed. So when I look at this, fathers ought to be balanced. Children ought to see that balance. As much as a child would see their father, perhaps not necessarily in the training, but when they would see something. I've always been in conversations with older people or just kind of watched, and I watched what they thought was important in life. It's just like if I was a kid today and I was around some adults like you guys and I heard a conversation about transgenderism or whatever. Just like when I was a kid, you hear people talk about whatever it was that really got them upset because society was going the other way. And I would listen, I would learn from that, because I'd say, well, this is something they like, this is something they don't like, and you kind of it just kind of was there in the back of your mind. But as you get older, you say, you know what? I remember the people growing up that they saw our day a coming, and they saw the demise of society if it's not done right. But I also saw the tenderheartedness. I saw how I saw the laughter. A child ought to see parents laugh. I mean, good night. It ain't all about, well, this is the way it is around here, and okay, kid, you're dismissed. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. There's nothing wrong with manners and order. The people ought to see the compassion. They ought to see the sympathy. They ought to see the tenderheartedness. Our God is balanced. Our God is a very balanced God. He's a God of love, but he's also a God that's holy, and that line would never be crossed for any reason. And that's where the world doesn't understand God. I think the world tries to play God and say, well, we're going to play God here, and we're just going to do the kumbaya mentality. And we'll love everybody, but we'll never raise the voice. There's nothing about sin. No one goes to hell. Well, that's just not true, folks. See, strength is telling the truth. It's like going to a doctor. If a doctor, I don't want the doctor to candy coat everything. If I've got a problem, tell me what the problem is. Give me the solutions or the options I have here. But that's the proper way to be in life. So lastly, here's how I put it this way. Fathers need to have their boundaries. They ought to know the rights and the wrongs. And many of the testimonies we've heard, we understood people being that way. Children ought to see the boundaries. They ought to hear what's right. They ought to hear what's wrong. They ought to say, that's wrong, and we were trained that way, and that's good. But they also ought to see the tenderheartedness. They ought to see a dad that can speak sternly and speak properly, of course, but the kind of dad that would, take them out in the backyard and play ball with them. For some reason, that has always been the illustration about children, a son, that really all they wanted to do is just have their dad spend a little bit of time with them. Again, life can be tough. I remember hearing the stories and even seeing it where a dad would work sometimes 2 jobs to provide for his family so his children can have clothes and food and all of that. It's tough, come in tired from working, and the children, because they got all the energy. And sometimes children can be unfair to say, well, my dad never played with me. Yeah, but let's also think about it this way. Did your dad work 8 to 12 hours? Did he have to work overtime a lot? Did he have a kind of job that just took all his strength? At the end of the day, he went to bed and got enough rest to get up and do it again. So we have to be fair with that. But on the other side of it is, there's also the aspect of, but these are the kids, here's young people, and they don't understand all the sternness of life, and they shouldn't have to understand all that. They should see the boundaries, and they ought to see the consequences of life. There's nothing wrong with that. That's proper. However, I think we do an injustice, even sometimes as a church. I get up here and preach the Bible, and I'm going to do that. But I'll tell you what, I'm also going to preach and be balanced enough to say, you know what, I'm not going to look at a verse like what we just read here and go, well, if I say that, that's going to seem like we're soft. No, that's like implying that God is all thunder and lightning, but he's not the lily and he's not the rose. And that's just not true. The God that made the lion, he also made it to where that lion would have little cubs, a little baby lion. I wouldn't want to mess with them too much. Me and Chris went to a petting zoo one time, and a man had these giant, powerful creatures in their baby form. And it's kind of neat. I'll tell you this little story. The guy had this little bear. He was, I guess it was a black bear. He's about that big, okay? And he had him in this like a little sand lot thing. And people sitting there playing with him, and he gave everybody, I think, either some carrots or some marshmallows to feed him. And that little old bear, he'd eat him, and he's a little bear. He was, maybe 30 pounds maybe, whatever he was. And everybody kind of went from that one and wanted to go see something else. Well, I was curious about that little bear, and I thought, that is interesting, because I was thinking, now that bear one of these days, in a year's time or less, they'll have to put him up and nobody can touch him, because we saw animals like that. We saw animals that people were petting the year before were pacing back and forth in this thing, and they would just, it would be instant death. But there's that little old bear, and I'm thinking, now one day he's going to be this powerful thing, and nobody can mess with him much, I guess. And I said, I'm going to just mess with him a little bit. And like you take a pup and you kind of, a little bit like that. Well, I mess with that little bear like that, and I give him this piece of, I think it was marshmallow, and he bit down on my finger. I don't know if he was trying to get the rest of it off, but I was trying to get my finger out of his mouth. And I realized just the power of the jaws of this little bear was like, I couldn't get out. If he decided to go over here, I had to I literally could not get my finger out of his mouth. His little old teeth and the power of those jaws were just like that, But I'm thinking, God made these animals. You look at a little kitten, you look at a little puppy, you look at anything, the sweetness of life. And God is so balanced. And most of us, that's what we see anyway. Life is that way for the most part. And sadly, we go through times in our life where there's going to be times they're downturns. Our health can fail us. And I'm looking at people, you've gone through things, you wish it wasn't that way, and I get that. God is gracious, and I understand that. But the way God deals with us, there's no way that if you really look at God, you look at his word and look at all of it and say, man, God, I'm so glad you're so balanced. I'm so glad that you love me and you did all you've done. I'm so glad that truth is truth. And I'll close with this. I heard a statement one time that, truth has its boundaries. If this is truth, truth has a boundary. If you go beyond the truth, you go into an area called a lie, or what is not truth. You go into an area that's not proper and right. God has his standards. He has the truth. Sin has no boundary. That's why we're living in a day where people say, what is truth? I don't want truth. I want to live my life the way I want to live it. So what you say is, okay, there's no boundaries. So we're looking at people. You would think the genders, for example, that's a boundary. You are what you are. God made you that. And yet someone says, you know what? Let's just take the truth. If you take the truth out of anything, You can make anything as bizarre and as weird as you want to. My uncle told me this, maybe you read this. He said I think it was there was some animal that they were trying to get on the endangered species list out in California. And I think it was some kind of a bumblebee or something like that. And for some reason, they couldn't get this thing passed. There wasn't enough evidence, whatever it was. And somehow they said, I'll tell you how we can get this done. They literally labeled the bumblebee as a species of fish. I kid you not. So in order to get this bumblebee, which I think is either a bumblebee or a bird, whatever it was, they made this fall under the species of a fish. Now, again, I'm not real bright, and you're probably brighter than I am. But if I go out to a lake or go down to the ocean, and I look in the water and I see a bumblebee swimming, I'm going, wow, well, there's a bumblebee fish. But so far, I've never seen bumblebees swim. I see them do what they do. Again, if they start making the fish a bumblebee, then again, if I'm out in my garden, and just this past week I was giving the chickens a bunch of clovers. You're down there and you're making sure you don't grab up a bumblebee. If I look down and I see a fish going from flower to flower, pollinating it, I'll go, that's interesting. I guess I've been wrong all these days. I guess a fish can live outside of water, and I guess that's really actually, an insect. Can you imagine how we could scratch our head about every single thing, just like we're scratching our head going, well, that's a boy, and that's a girl, and this is that, and this is that. And again, there's a reason, because there's no boundaries. God has his boundaries. But I'm so glad that when it comes to things like his love, his sympathy, and all of that, he is boundless in it, though. His mercy is everlasting. His truth is everlasting, but they are in their own departments. They are in their own segments. They are in their own compartment. And God says, fathers, just like as you would pity your children, meaning you're tenderhearted to them. They're your children, and that's an aspect. The same thing applies when a child is being taught to do the right things. And if there's corporal punishment involved, that's because of love. It's because of truth. It's because it's trying to teach a boundary in life. Just like truth or a lie. There is a boundary. There is a cap to a certain truth. It is what it is, and beyond that is error. So I say, as we live our life, let people see our balance. Let people see our tenderness. As a rule, ladies, you seem to be the more tender side of between men and women. I get that. But I think, just like we all know, mamas could be very, very, very strong, and they had to be. And, of course, they were compassionate. But I think sometimes the world tries to tell a guy that if you show any softness, that's weakness. And that's just an absolute lie. In fact, I think that's part of what makes our society the way it is they have really, really attacked fatherhood and men. And again, I can go into another discussion here, but you look at what happened in Hollywood, what they did to men, and the father was just become a big doofus. He has no clue what's going on. He's out of touch with reality. His kids think he's the biggest idiot in the world, and that's how they portrayed a lot of dads, and that's just wrong. Or they portrayed him to be some kind of a burly guy, but he has nothing else to him. I'm glad the Bible has the answers. It teaches us what we need to know. And I'm glad, as a father would pity his children, which is proper and right, God does the same thing to us. So I'm asking you to bow your head this evening. We'll have our invitation.